The screech of tires sliced through the humid afternoon air as Brooklyn lunged forward without thinking. Her fingers closed around Adeline's wrist, and she yanked with every ounce of strength she possessed, pulling her classmate back from the path of the massive delivery truck that had just barreled around the corner. Both girls tumbled onto the cracked sidewalk, the impact knocking the wind from Brooklyn's lungs while the truck's horn blared like an angry judgment. For one frozen second the world was nothing but the smell of hot asphalt and the frantic thud of her own heartbeat. Then Adeline's eyes fluttered open inches from hers, and something shifted, something Brooklyn could not yet name. People rushed and shouting for an ambulance. Brooklyn sat up, dazed, her palms scraped raw from the concrete. Adeline groaned, trying to push herself upright, but her left leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood already soaked through her jeans. You saved me," Adeline whispered, her voice hoarse with shock. Brooklyn could only nod, too stunned to speak. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, until they swallowed everything else. Paramedics loaded Adeline onto a stretcher, and before Brooklyn realized what was happening, she was riding in the back of the ambulance, clutching the other girl's cold hand, like it was the only steady thing left in her universe. At the hospital, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Brooklyn paced the linoleum floor, still wearing her blood-speckled school hoodie. Her phone buzzed nonstop with texts from her mother asking why she had missed youth group. She silenced it. When the doctor finally emerged, he said Adeline had a fractured tibia, a mild concussion, and bruised ribs, but she was stable, and asking for the girl who pulled her from the street. Brooklyn followed him down the sterile corridor, her sneakers squeaking like accusations. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitor beeping steadily beside the bed. Adeline turned her head slowly, and their eyes met again. This time the gaze held. It was not gratitude alone. It was recognition, a silent conversation neither of them had words for yet. Brooklyn felt her chest tighten as if the air itself had grown heavier. She had always known right from wrong, had memorized every verse about purity and sin, but standing there under the fluorescent hum, she felt something stir that no sermon had ever prepared her for. Adeline smiled weakly. "You didn't have to risk your life for me, you know." Her voice was soft, almost teasing, but her eyes stayed locked on Brooklyn, searching. Brooklyn swallowed hard. "I couldn't just watch." She pulled up the plastic chair and sat, her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her in prayer meetings. They talked, then really talked, about nothing and everything: the upcoming finals, the terrible cafeteria pizza, the way the town always smelled like rain after church. Hours slipped by unnoticed. When a nurse finally shooed Brooklyn out, it was past midnight. She drove home through quiet streets, replaying every second of that hospital gaze. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked the same brown hair, same freckles across her nose. Yet she felt changed, like a crack had opened in the foundation she had built her whole life upon. She whispered a quick prayer before bed, but the words felt hollow for the first time. The next morning her mother stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples for a pie, the radio playing soft hymns. "Pastor Daniels called," she said without turning around. "He wants to know if you're all right after yesterday's heroics." Brooklyn forced a smile and reached for the orange juice. "I'm fine, Mom. Just glad Adeline's okay." Her mother studied her for a long moment, the knife paused mid-slice. "You did a good thing, honey. God rewards the righteous." Brooklyn nodded, but the praise tasted bitter. She excused herself to her room and stared at the cross hanging above her bed, the one her grandmother had given her on confirmation day. For the first time the wooden symbol felt heavy, like it was watching her, judge her. She shook the thought away, grabbed her backpack and headed back to the hospital. Adeline's room was brighter today, sunlight slanting through the blinds, painting golden stripes across the sheets. When Brooklyn walked in, Adeline's face lit up in a way that made Brooklyn's stomach flip. "You came back," Adeline said, her voice warm. "I was hoping you would." They talked again, longer this time, about dreams and fears and the weight of expectations. Adeline confessed she had always felt different, never quite fitting the mold her own family tried to press her into. Brooklyn listened, mesmerized by the honesty. When visiting hours ended, she left with a promise to return the next day, and the crack inside her chest widened just a little more. By the third visit, the hospital had begun to feel less like a place of crisis and more like a secret sanctuary. Brooklyn brought Adeline a small bouquet of daisies from the supermarket, the only flowers she could afford. Adeline's laughter when she saw them was bright and real, cutting through the sterile quiet. You're spoiling me, Hayes, she teased, using Brooklyn's last name the way only close friends did at school. Brooklyn blushed and set the vase on the windowsill, trying to ignore how her pulse quickened every time Adeline looked at her that way. They played cards on the adjustable tray, Adeline cheating shamelessly and Brooklyn pretending to be outraged. Between games the conversation turned deeper. Adeline spoke about growing up with a single mom who worked double shifts and never had time for church or rules. I've always been free to figure out who I am, she said quietly. Must be nice, Brooklyn replied before she could stop herself. Adeline tilted her head, studying her. And who are you figuring out you are, Brooklyn? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Brooklyn looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. I'm the girl who goes to youth group, helps with the church bake sales, and is supposed to marry a nice Christian boy someday. She laughed, but it sounded brittle. Adeline reached out, her hand resting lightly on Brooklyn's wrist. The touch was innocent, yet it sent electricity racing up Brooklyn's arm. Maybe there's more to you than that, Adeline whispered. Brooklyn didn't pull away. That night at home, Brooklyn knelt by her bed as always, but the familiar words of the Lord's Prayer tangled in her throat. She kept seeing Adeline's eyes, the way they softened when she smiled. Guilt crashed over her like a wave. She opened her Bible to Romans chapter 1, the passage her father had quoted last Sunday about unnatural relations. The verses blurred. She slammed the book shut and pressed her forehead to the mattress, whispering, "Forgive me," over and over until her voice cracked. Sleep came in fitful bursts, filled with dreams of running through endless corridors, Adeline's hand slipping from hers just as she reached out. The following afternoon, Brooklyn skipped her last class and drove straight to the hospital. Adeline was sitting up, her cast propped on a pillow. The doctor had said she could go home in 2 days. I'll miss our talks, Adeline admitted when Brooklyn arrived. Me too, Brooklyn said before she could think better of it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Adeline asked, "Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life?" Brooklyn nodded slowly. Every Sunday when I smile and sing the hymns, but inside I'm screaming questions no one wants to answer. The confession slipped out raw and honest. Adeline's fingers brushed hers again, this time lingering. You're not alone, Brooklyn. Not anymore. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat the room disappeared. Brooklyn felt the pull stronger now, impossible to deny. When she left that evening, she drove past the church without stopping, the steeple silhouetted against the sunset like a silent warning. She chose not to heed. Adeline's discharge day arrived with pouring rain that matched the storm brewing inside Brooklyn. She waited outside the hospital entrance holding an umbrella and a bag of Adeline's favorite snacks. When the automatic doors slid open and Adeline emerged on crutches, Brooklyn's heart did a traitorous flip. My hero once again, Adeline grinned as Brooklyn helped her into the passenger seat. The drive to Adeline's apartment was quiet but charged. Brooklyn kept glancing sideways, memorizing the curve of Adeline's jaw, the way her damp hair curled at the temples. They ordered pizza and watched old movies on the couch, Adeline's leg elevated on pillows. Halfway through the second film, their shoulders touched, and neither moved away. The credits rolled and the room grew still. Thank you for everything, Adeline said, turning to face her. Brooklyn opened her mouth to reply, but the words dissolved when Adeline leaned in and pressed the softest kiss to her lips. It lasted only seconds, yet it shattered every rule Brooklyn had ever lived by. She pulled back, eyes wide, but Adeline was smiling gently. I've wanted to do that since the first day you sat in that hospital chair. Brooklyn touched her own lips, stunned. I don't know what I'm doing. Adeline took her hand. Then let's figure it out together. No pressure. Just us. The next weeks blurred into stolen moments after school, secret drives to the lake where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Brooklyn's prayers grew shorter, her guilt louder. She stopped going to youth group, claiming she needed to study. Her mother noticed the change but said nothing at first. One evening, after a particularly long kiss in Adeline's car, Brooklyn sat in her driveway, unable to go inside. She stared at the cross on the dashboard her father had placed there years ago. This is wrong, she whispered to the empty vehicle. Yet when she closed her eyes, all she saw was Adeline's face and the peace she felt in her presence. The contradiction tore at her until she cried silent tears that left tracks on her cheeks. Adeline never pushed. She listened when Brooklyn confessed her fears about disappointing God, her family, the entire community that had raised her. I was taught that this kind of love is a sin, Brooklyn admitted one rainy afternoon. Adeline nodded thoughtfully. And I was taught that love is never a sin if it's honest. Maybe both of us are right in our own way. Their conversations became a lifeline, Brooklyn clinging to every word like a drowning person grasping driftwood. Slowly the fear began to loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe she could be both the girl her parents loved and the girl who loved Adeline. The first crack appeared at Sunday dinner. Brooklyn's father set down his fork and asked why she had missed 3 services in a row. She mumbled something about exams, but her mother's sharp eyes told her the excuse was thin. Later that night her mother knocked on her bedroom door. "Talk to me, honey. You've been different since the accident." Brooklyn wanted to lie, but the weight of secrecy pressed too hard. She told her mother everything in halting sentences: the hospital, the talks, the kiss. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Her mother's face paled. "That girl has confused you. This is the devil's temptation, Brooklyn. We'll pray it away together." The next day Pastor Daniels appeared at their door, Bible in hand. He spoke kindly but firmly about the narrow path and the broad road to destruction. Brooklyn sat on the couch, fists clenched, listening to verses she had once believed without question. "I love her," she said quietly when he finished. The pastor sighed. "Love is patient, love is kind, but it must align with God's design, son." The word son stung more than any sermon. Her father stood by the door, arms crossed, his disappointment a physical presence in the room. "We raised you better than this." Adeline waited at their usual spot by the lake, her crutches leaning against the bench. When Brooklyn arrived in tears, Adeline held her without asking questions. "They think I'm broken," Brooklyn sobbed into her shoulder. "Maybe I'm the one who's whole for the first time." They stayed there until the stars came out, talking through the pain, the fear, the certainty that neither could go back. Adeline's own mother had suspected and offered quiet support, surprising them both. The contrast between the two families only sharpened the knife. Brooklyn began to see how love could be both the most beautiful and the most destructive force she had ever known. The arguments at home escalated. Her mother left pamphlets about conversion therapy on her pillow. Her father stopped speaking to her altogether, choosing instead to pray loudly in the living room each evening. Brooklyn moved through school like a ghost, smiling for her friends while her heart fractured a little more each day. Yet every evening she drove to Adeline's apartment, and in those hours she felt alive, whole. The push and pull between worlds grew unbearable, but still she refused to choose. Not yet. The breaking point came at the annual church picnic. Brooklyn had agreed to attend, hoping to keep the peace, but Adeline came too at Brooklyn's quiet invitation. They stayed at opposite ends of the field at first. Then during the 3-legged race their eyes met across the grass, and the pull became impossible to resist. They slipped behind the pavilion and shared a brief, desperate kiss. Someone saw. Whispers spread faster than the summer wind. By the time the sun set, her father was waiting at the car, his face thunderous. The ride home was silent until he pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. "You have until morning to repent, or you're no longer welcome under this roof." Brooklyn packed a bag that night, tears streaming as she folded the quilt her grandmother had sewn. Her mother stood in the doorway pleading, "Please don't throw your eternal soul away for this girl." Brooklyn looked at her one last time. "I'm not throwing anything away, Mom. I'm finally picking it up." She moved in with Adeline, the apartment suddenly feeling both like freedom and exile. The church community she had known her entire life closed ranks. Texts stopped coming. Friends crossed the street when they saw her. The isolation was a living thing pressing on her chest every morning. Adeline held her through the worst nights, whispering that she was enough, that their love was enough. Brooklyn wanted to believe her. She started seeing a counselor recommended by Adeline's mother, someone who didn't quote scripture, but asked questions instead. Slowly the voices in her head, the one screaming sinner, began to quiet, replaced by her own voice asking what kind of God would demand she hate the truest part of herself. Her father called once. The conversation was short and shattering. "We love you, Brooklyn, but we love God more. When you're ready to come home, the door is open." She hung up and cried until she had no tears left. Adeline sat beside her on the floor, holding her hand. "You don't have to choose between us and them. You just have to choose yourself." The words settled deep. For the first time Brooklyn felt the stirrings of acceptance, not victory but a quiet, steady resolve. Months passed and seasons changed. Brooklyn's leg healed, but the fractures inside both girls ran deeper and mended differently. They built a life together, small and careful. Brooklyn got a part-time job at the local bookstore. Adeline returned to school on a scholarship. They cooked dinner side by side, laughed at bad movies, and held each other on nights when the past felt too heavy. The happiness was real, yet it carried the shadow of everything they had lost. Brooklyn still prayed, sometimes not the scripted words of her childhood, but simple, honest conversations with a God she hoped could understand love in all its forms. She no longer attended church, but she kept the small wooden cross in her drawer, a reminder not of shame but of the girl she used to be. One crisp autumn evening they sat on the fire escape watching the city lights flicker on. Adeline rested her head on Brooklyn's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Brooklyn thought of her mother's disappointed eyes, her father's silence, the empty pew where she once Saturday. "I regret the pain I caused," she answered. "But I don't regret loving you. I can't." They stayed there until the stars appeared above the rooftops, two young women who had walked through fire and emerged scarred but standing. The journey had not ended in triumph. It had ended in truth, the hardest kind, the kind that asks you to carry both grief and gratitude in the same heart. And in the quiet that followed, the only question left was this: was Brooklyn right to follow the love that set her free, or did she lose more than she gained by choosing herself over everything she had once called holy?